Welcome back to another repair job on my MG ZS 180. What we're dealing with here is very common on these cars, an utterly useless clutch pedal. You can see it's just got no resistance whatsoever. Looking under the bonnet, it's very obvious why that is. The plastic slave cylinder is no longer properly attached to its bracket. So let's go ahead and remove that to have a closer look. This plastic C-clip is what's meant to secure it to the bracket, but it's doing nothing helpful at present, and the slave can just be grabbed and pulled out. You can see there's some damage to the body of it, and it's been leaking fluid due to the piston overextending out when the pedal was pressed with it detached. On the back end of it, there's the hydraulic connection, but no bleed nipple. The system isn't designed to be bled, it's meant to be bought as a pre-filled assembly with an inline quick connector and just clipped into place. So, that's why it's a bit rubbish. What can we do about it? Well, you could just replace it with another standard one, but they're not all that cheap, and it'll probably fail again at some point. Luckily, many years ago, a chap who goes by the name of Sheddist worked out that you can replace the plastic components with metal Honda ones using a custom bracket, and you can simply go out and buy a kit like this from a few different places online. However, it isn't strictly necessary to buy a kit, you can just buy the components and modify the car's original bracket to work with them, which is what I'm going to do here. First, the clutch master cylinder needs to come out as well. This is held in with two nuts and a pin through the clevis attaching it to the pedal arm. We'll do the clevis pin first, pulling the retaining clip out with some pliers, and then it just pushes out. After that, it's the nuts securing the body of the master cylinder to the bulkhead. Apologies for the somewhat poor video quality, but it's not the easiest area of a car to film while also working on it and being able to see what you're doing. Incidentally, the studs the nuts attached to aren't on the master cylinder itself, they're on a separate metal plate that clamps the master cylinder into place. Getting the master cylinder out is a bit fiddly because of how it's tucked around the back of the engine. Not sure if the 4-cylinder models are any easier, but it can be removed with some patience. So this is the standard hydraulic setup. You have the master cylinder with its integrated fluid reservoir, and as you follow along the hydraulic line, halfway along there's a quick connector. When you buy either the master or the slave, you get the cylinder and the hydraulic line up to this connector, and the two components attached together there. Moving down to the slave cylinder, we already had a look at this earlier, and yep, it's still rubbish. So let's move on to getting the bracket for it off the gearbox. There's 3 bolts holding the bracket on, and access is pretty good. The ugly lumps of box section you see here are something that someone's added in an attempt to give the slave cylinder some additional bracing to push against, and thus avoid having it fail. But as you're watching this video, I think we can make an educated guess as to how much that helped. Out comes the bracket, and you can get a better look at that box section modification welded onto it. If we put the clutch slave in the position of the bracket, you can see how it was intended to butt up against this bracing. Honestly, this is a pretty sensible decision, and it probably did help somewhat, but the fundamental design of the system is just too poor. Now, let's compare our Honda slave cylinder. As well as being made from a metal casting, it has some good solid mounting tabs on it, which seem like a much better way of attaching it than the MG Rover plastic clip design. To see how it will fit onto the bracket, we first need to remove those bits of box section. There we go. And the Honda cylinder looks like it will line up nicely with the location of the original one. But these little mounting tabs where the old one hooked in will be in the way, and we don't need them, so I'll cut those off. While I've got the grinder out, I'm also going to attack this offcut of steel plate to give me the component parts of the bracket modifications. Here's the first one. This is going to be down the middle of the bracket like this to support where the actual mount will be going. That gets tack welded in place for the time being. For the mount itself, I'm going to use some spare bolts to create mounting studs for the slave cylinder. Their heads won't fit in the space I have on the rear face, so they get cut off. Then I use a flange nut to set the stud at the right depth and clamp it in place with some mole grips. That lets me then weld it in place from the rear. With the studs attached, that part of the bracket can also be tacked in place. And once I've confirmed it's all aligned correctly, it'll be fully welded and I'll give it a blow over some black paint. That leaves us with this. And you can see how the slave fits neatly into place on it. One thing I did have to do was to slightly dress the top part of the bracket to make sure there's good access where the hydraulic connector goes, but it's only a small amount needed. So let's get this mounted onto the gearbox. One thing to watch for is that one of the bolts also secures the main earth of the engine, so don't miss that or you'll not have a running car when you're finished. Before the slave cylinder can be fitted, I need to change the actuator rod, as the Honda one is too short. This is why the brackets you can buy commonly mount the cylinder further out than the original position, but I'm going to use the original rod as a dome here, just shortening it by a small amount where it seats in the slave piston. Once the cut end is dressed smooth, you can see it fits about right in the slave cylinder. So before it goes on, we need the rubber boot on it to stop crud getting in there. Then, with a small dab of grease on the end of it, the rubber boot fits to the cylinder body and acts to hold the rod somewhat captive in place. The slave cylinder goes onto the bracket and some large flange nuts secure it in place. Let's deal with the other end of the hydraulics now, with the master cylinder. Here's our new metal one in comparison to the old plastic one. And yes, because of the MG's Honda origins, those integrated stud mounts do align correctly with the holes in the bulkhead. However, the clevis design is slightly different, so I'm going to use this one instead, which I think will work better. We also need our hydraulic line to connect the two cylinders together, and for this I'm using a cheap motorbike brake hose with a banjo fitting at either end. So this attaches with a through bolt and a couple of copper washers. Getting the new master cylinder into place is a bit easier than removing the old one was. The braided hose gets routed around the engine bay, we'll come back to that later, but first it's back into the footwell to properly attach the master cylinder. This is then followed by the clevis pin through the clevis and pedal arm. One thing you can see is that someone has added a rubber bump stop to limit the upward pedal travel, because these cars do usually have quite high pedals. However, it can interfere with the correct operation of the hydraulics by limiting the master cylinder stroke, so I'll be removing that. Here we see the hose routed around to the slave cylinder, so let's get that attached. Again, it's a banjo fitting, so a through bolt and a copper washer are all that's needed. Once this is attached, the hydraulics are good to go, but we still need a master cylinder reservoir for the fluid supply. I'm using a cheap one meant for motorbike brakes, but a lot of cars have a separate clutch master reservoir that would also be suitable. We're all done now. All that's left to do is top up with some fluid and bleed through the system. I'm using my pneumatic vacuum bleeder, which makes this a very easy job. And there you have it, a working clutch once more. And hopefully this setup will be a bit tougher than the original plastic design. There's still more work to be done on this ZS180, so if you want to see what else was needed, please subscribe to my channel and join me again for another video soon.